Many real-world applications have two special modules that are completely independent of the rest of the architecture. And these are a module for the project configuration and also a module for some general helper functions that are going to be useful across the entire project. And so let's now implement these modules in our own project. And let's start with the configuration module. So let's maybe close this one here first. And then in our JS folder, we create a new file, config.js. Okay. And so here into this file, we will basically put all the variables that should be constants and should be reused across the project. And the goal of having this file with all these variables is that it will allow us to easily configure our project by simply changing some of the data that is here in this configuration file. So therefore the name of config. So of course, we will not want to put all the variables here in this file. The only variables that we do want here are the ones that are responsible for kind of defining some important data about the application itself. So one example of that is, for example, the API URL. All right. So this URL here, we will actually reuse in multiple places across this project. For example, for getting search data and also for uploading a recipe to the server. And so all of them will use this URL. But then imagine that at some point the URL needs to change. For example, because there might be a version 3 at some point. And so as always, we don't want to change that everywhere and simply have a variable which contains this, which we can then reuse. So let's cut this here. And you might argue that we can also simply create a variable here in the model, but then we would have all these configuration variables spread across multiple modules. But it's way easier to simply have all of those variables in one central place. And so that's what we're going to do here. So let's call this one API URL and then paste that here. Okay. And now all we have to do is to export this constant from here. So I'm using uppercase here because this is basically a constant that will never change. And so using uppercase for that kind of variable is kind of a common practice, especially in a configuration file like this. So API URL is one of the variables that makes a lot of sense. And let's actually go to our documentation page, because indeed, as I mentioned before, we are going to use this URL for this and also for getting recipes. So then we will simply have to add the /id. Another great candidate for being a configuration variable is going to be this API key that we will generate a bit later. So let's leave that for now and go back here to this API URL and now actually import that here into the model. So import, and now remember that here we have a named import. And later we will actually also have more named imports. Okay, and so here I could go ahead and import all of them basically at the same time and then as config. But actually I prefer to import them one by one, basically with their actual name. And so remember, we do that by using curly braces and then the name of the variable like this. And then config is in the same folder. And so that should work. And here, all we have to do now is to replace, or to actually put, that API URL right here. So if we save this now, then our application, well, let's see. And yeah, it is back to working, right? And so we successfully basically exported this configuration value that we had here into this config file. Okay, next up, let's create a new file for some helper functions. So this one is usually called helpers.js, and the goal of this file or of this module is to contain a couple of functions that we reuse over and over in our project. And so here in this module, we then have a central place for all of them, basically. And to start, one great candidate is to actually create a function which will get JSON. So basically a function which encapsulates all of this and also some of the error handling. All right, so let's actually get all of this code and go here into the helpers. And so here let's create a function and export it called getJSON. And so this function is going to be very similar to what we did in the async JavaScript section. So it's going to be an async function which will basically do the fetching and also converting to JSON all in one step. And so with this, we abstract all this functionality into one nice function that we can then use all over our project. And probably we will just use this actually in our model in this case, but it's still good to have this function in this kind of central place. Okay, so anyway, this getJSON function will take a URL, and so of course this is then what we fetch here. Right, and so with this we can then reuse this function here for all kinds of URLs. Now this here actually already makes sense, and this one here as well. So let's now put all of this into a try block and then catch the error here. Now, what are we going to do with the error here? Of course, we could log it or alert it, as always, to the console, but let's say we actually want to handle that error here in this function. So right here, where we will actually use the getJSON method. And actually, let's do that right away. So import that first, of course. So import, and again, we are using named imports, and I simply want to import the exact variable name. So that's getJSON from helpers, and it's not appearing here, and I just noticed that helpers is actually in the wrong folder. So I put it in the views folder, but it's supposed to be in the JS folder. Okay, and so let's now actually use getJSON here and then think about the error handling that we were just talking about previously. So here let's say const data will be await getJSON, and then with this same URL here. Okay, and so again, this is exactly what we had done before. There's just one thing missing here. Now we get these errors, which is really annoying. But anyway, there's actually still something missing here, which is to then actually return the data from this function, right? So we didn't do that yet. And so of course we want to return the data. And now, just as we did also in the last video, we have one async function here. So the load recipe function calling another async function, which is this getJSON function. Now this function returns this data variable, and so therefore this data is going to be the resolved value of the promise that the getJSON function returns. And if that still sounds super confusing, then you might just revisit that lecture in the asynchronous JavaScript section. But anyway, what you need to keep in mind is that here this data will become the resolved value of this promise. And so here, that's why we then await that promise and store that resolved value into the data variable. And so then the rest here is going to work in the same way. But now back to error handling. And let's say here we want to actually not alert, but to log that error to the console. Let's say console.error, and then here the error. And let's say we want to do it in a special way, just so we see which errors are our own. So using some emoji here to make it really visible. So this is here our temporary error handling, which we will improve dramatically in one of the next lectures. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that the error is actually occurring here, right? It is going to occur in the getJSON function and not here. Remember that? So when there's going to be an error here in this function, then the promise that the getJSON function returns is actually still being fulfilled. So it's still basically a successful promise, even if there happened an error here. And so let me show that to you actually. So now everything works just fine. But let's now use some invalid URL here. Then we get some error here, but that's not the one we are interested in. So the actual error is this one here, and it's coming now from helpers.js at line 5, or actually line 11. So this is the error that we're logging right here. So this one here, right? So we're logging it to the console here, right in the helpers function. However, this is actually not where we want to handle that error. We really would like to handle it right here in model.js. So basically, instead of this error message here, which is simply a consequence of this first error, we would like to get this error message inside of the model, right? So do you remember how we do that? Well, we have to rethrow the error. So we have to again use throw and then simply take the error object that we already have and simply throw this new error. And so now with this, the promise that's being returned from getJSON will actually reject. Okay, and so then we will be able to actually handle the error right here. So let's try that again. And indeed, now we get that same error message that we had before right here in the model as we wanted. Okay, so we basically propagated the error down from one async function to the other by rethrowing the error here in this catch block. And that's really important to do, and we will actually come back to this in one of the future lectures. Okay, and now to finish, let's make this function here a little bit more robust and more real world by adding some timeout. So basically setting a time after which we make the request fail. And so this is important in order to prevent for really bad internet connections where then this fetch here could be running forever. And we actually already did that previously in the async JavaScript section. And so here in the controller starter code, I had already this timeout function. So we don't have to code it all over again. And so let's put that here. And so basically what this function does is that it will return a new promise. So this promise here, which will reject after a certain number of seconds. And so in order to now use this function here, we will have a race between this timeout promise, which will take whatever seconds we pass into it, and this fetch function here, which is the one responsible for getting the data. And then whatever occurs first will win the race. So let me just put that in code actually. So remember that works by using promise.race, and this takes in two promises. So the first promise is this one, and then the second promise will be timeout with a certain number of seconds. And here for now, let's just say 10 seconds. Or actually, let's just say 0.5 seconds so that we can actually test this. So here we're still getting some errors from somewhere in our code, because of this error. But never mind. Oh, and now Google Chrome crashed. And here we are back. So let's just again click somewhere here. Now we still get this weird error. So let's actually check out what's happening here with cannot read property JSON of undefined. Well, maybe it's already because of this timeout here. So let's try to put it to like 5 seconds. Let's try it again. But it's got to be something else. So it seems like there is some problem somewhere here. So here, for some reason, is this parenthesis, which doesn't make any sense. But it is VS Code which for some reason puts it there for us. But this parenthesis doesn't make any sense because now this looks like just one element of this array. So let's just create this promise outside. So fetch promise is going to be this. And so hopefully that will fix it. Well, it doesn't. Oh, but I see what's the problem. I'm actually not even calling promise.raise. I only put the brackets there. So that was probably the reason. And so now it should work indeed. And so if we reload this, then yeah, it works. So now we can actually test what's happening here with the time. So setting it to half a second. And so that still works. And so let's make our network a little bit slower. So a slow 3G. And this should then take some time. And so let's see if we can now time out the request. So let's wait for it. And indeed, now the request took too long, timeout after half a second. Okay, so let's analyze what happened here. So we passed in half a second here, and so after that time has passed, this promise simply rejected with this error message. And so as soon as any of these promises here in the race rejects or fulfills, then that promise will become the winner. And so therefore, we now have a rejected promise here, which will then trigger the catch block here. And so that error will then be thrown again here, and then it will make its way here into the load recipe function, and eventually will be handled down here. And so that's why we get these 4 explosions down here in the error message. All right. Now, of course, then in the real world, we will want to do something with that error. But again, a bit more on actual error handling a bit later in the section. For now, let's set a more realistic value here. So of course, we don't want to time out after just half a second. Let's say like 10 seconds. Now, in fact, this is one of these so-called magic numbers or magic values, which is like a value that seems to appear out of nowhere. So if someone reads this code, they will find this number 10 and not really understand what it's doing. And so one more time, this is a perfect candidate for a configuration value. So this is really something that we might want to change about our application. And so then if we want to do that, all we have to do is to come to our config file and change that here. So let's call this one timeout seconds and set it to 10. Okay. Then here we can import that. So again is a named import. And so here we use the curly braces. So timeout seconds from helpers index.js. And this import that is already here was probably put here by a parcel. So I don't remember doing this here. And so it must have been Parcel who put this here in order to make the code work. Okay? And so now here we can use the timeout second constant. And so now whoever is going to read this code will see that this is one of the configuration values. So first, because it is in this uppercase, and so that helps already with understanding the code. And then also because now it is a variable. And so it's no longer like a magic number that we don't really understand where it's coming from. Okay? And so that's exactly what this configuration file here is all about. So these are two important files that are used in many applications in the real world. And so make sure to also include them in some way in your own applications in the future. Okay? And now in the next video, we will kind of finish this architecture and really implement the missing part here, which is kind of handling the events in a better way. And so let's go do that right now.